There are thresholds in your life that you don't recognize until you've been standing before them for a very long time. They don't announce themselves with grand archways or ornate carvings. They are quiet, unassuming things. A pause in a conversation. A glance held a second too long. A door left slightly ajar. For months, my threshold had been the 6-inch gap of Julian's bedroom door. It was an invitation and a defense, a question and a statement, all at once. A slice of warm, low-wattage light cutting through the hallway's gloom, painting a single, expectant line on the polished hardwood floor. It was a space just wide enough to admit a person, but narrow enough to maintain plausible deniability. He could claim he'd just forgotten to close it properly, that the latch hadn't caught. And I, in turn, could pretend I hadn't noticed it at all. We had been living in this architectural limbo for what felt like an eternity, suspended in the quiet space between friendship and something else. A space made of unspoken questions and carefully measured breaths. Tonight, the silence in his apartment was different. It was heavier, somehow. The usual city symphony, the distant wail of a siren, the rhythmic hiss of a bus's air brakes, seemed muffled, as if the building itself were holding its breath. I stood in the hallway, my hand resting on the cool, smooth wood of the doorframe, my thumb tracing the edge. From inside his room, I could hear the soft rustle of sheets, the sound of him shifting his weight in bed. He wasn't asleep. I knew he wasn't. We had long since passed the point of needing to pretend. The ritual had become too established, its steps too familiar. He would come home, exhausted from a week of coding and client calls, his usual vibrant energy worn down to a fragile, translucent film. We would order takeout, watch some mindless movie on his ridiculously large television, and he would, inevitably, drift off, his head finding its way to my shoulder as if guided by some magnetic, unshakable force. Then came the delicate part of the evening, the transfer. I would gently wake him, my voice a low murmur, and he would stumble, half asleep, to his room, leaving the door open in that specific, deliberate way. He was leaving a space for me. And every time, I would stand here, in the dim light of the hallway, waging the same silent war with myself. To cross that threshold felt like a confession. It felt like admitting that the careful scaffolding of our friendship was no longer enough to support the weight of whatever this had become. To stay out here felt like a lie, a denial of the gravitational pull that had been steadily intensifying between us for the past year. Every night was a test of courage, a choice between the safety of the known and the terrifying, beautiful possibility of the unknown. The line of light on the floor was a dare, a quiet, persistent whisper. It asked a question I wasn't sure I was ready to answer because I was terrified of what his answer would be in return. I was a photographer by trade. My life was about observing, about framing moments and capturing them from a safe distance. I understood light and shadow, composition and context. But the scene before me was impossible to frame. It was fluid, dynamic, its meaning shifting with every beat of my own anxious heart. I could see the story I wanted to capture, the ending I desperately hoped for, but my hands were shaking too much to press the shutter. It had all started with a shared taxi in the rain. A beginning so cinematic it felt scripted, a cliché I would have rolled my eyes at had I seen it in a film. But life rarely cares for originality. It was a Tuesday night in late October, the kind of rain that wasn't content to simply fall, but seemed to want to soak the world from the inside out. The city lights bled across the wet asphalt, turning the streets into a smear of neon watercolors. I had been at a gallery opening for a friend, an event filled with cheap wine and expensive egos, and I was desperate to get back to the quiet sanctuary of my own apartment. I stood at the curb, my jacket collar turned up against the wind, trying and failing to hail a cab. Every yellow car that passed was already occupied, its rooftop light dark and indifferent. And then I saw him, about 20 feet down the block, engaged in the same futile ritual. Julian. Even then, drenched and frustrated, he had a kind of kinetic energy about him, a brightness that seemed to defy the miserable weather. He was motion, even in stillness. He saw me, and a look of shared, comical desperation passed between us. A moment later, A taxi finally slowed, its light a beacon of hope. We both lunged for it. Our hands met on the cold metal of the door handle. It was a jolt, a brief spark of contact in the damp air. We looked at each other, and he laughed. It wasn't a small, polite laugh. It was a full, uninhibited sound that seemed to push back against the gloom of the night. It was the sound of someone who found joy easily. "Looks like we're in the same boat," he said, his voice warm. "Or, well, chasing the same cab." I found myself smiling back, a genuine smile that felt foreign on my face after an evening of feigned politeness. "You can take it," I offered. "I'm not in a huge rush." He shook his head, rain dripping from the ends of his dark hair. "Nonsense. Where are you headed?" "Maybe we're going in the same direction." We weren't, not really. His destination was a good 15 blocks past mine, in the opposite direction from the most direct route to his own place. But he insisted, bundling me into the back seat as if we were old friends, and in that small, warm, leather-scented space, hurtling through the rain-streaked city, our friendship began. It was easy with Julian. Frighteningly so. I've always been a person who holds back, who takes time to build trust, constructing walls brick by careful brick. With him, there were no walls. It was as if I met him in a room I had already lived in for years. Our conversations flowed like a river that had always known its course. We talked about everything and nothing. His job as a software engineer, which he described with a kind of passionate frustration that I found endearing. My photography, my endless search for the honest moment. Our shared love for old sci-fi movies and terrible pizza from the place on the corner. By the time the taxi dropped me off, we had exchanged numbers, and he had made me promise to send him a link to my online portfolio. I watched the cab pull away, its red taillights shrinking into the wet darkness, and I felt a strange sense of certainty. It was the feeling of a significant chapter beginning, even if I didn't yet know the story. Our friendship solidified in a series of small, ordinary moments that, when stitched together, created the fabric of our shared lives. There were the Sunday mornings spent at a cramped diner, arguing over the last piece of bacon and dissecting the week's events. There were the late nights at his apartment, helping him untangle some impossible knot of code, my role being less about technical support and more about providing a steady supply of coffee and moral encouragement. He, in turn, became my most honest critic and my biggest supporter. He'd come to my studio, a small, light-filled space above a bakery that always smelled faintly of yeast and sugar, and spend hours looking at my contact sheets. He had an untrained but remarkably intuitive eye. He wouldn't use technical terms like composition or exposure, but he would point to a photo and say, That one feels real. It feels like you were holding your breath when you took it." He saw me, in a way that few people ever had. He saw the world through my eyes. The moment I knew I was in love with him was, like our meeting, deceptively mundane. It wasn't a grand, cinematic revelation. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon. We were in my apartment, assembling a ridiculously complicated bookshelf he had bought. The air was filled with the smell of sawdust and varnish, and the floor was littered with wooden dowels, mysterious screws, and incomprehensible instructions. Julian was on his hands and knees, brow furrowed in concentration, trying to decipher a particularly cryptic diagram. A stray beam of afternoon sunlight cut through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and catching in his hair, turning the dark strands to bronze. He looked up at me, a smudge of dirt on his cheek, and gave me that wide, unself-conscious grin. "I think Piece G is a lie," he declared with absolute seriousness. "I think the Swedish furniture cartel invented it just to break our spirits." And in that moment, watching him, surrounded by the beautiful chaos of our attempt to build something together, my heart just gave way. It wasn't a violent crash. It was a quiet, gentle surrender. A lock clicking into place. "Oh," I thought, with a sense of calm and terror that was almost dizzying. "It's him." And just as quickly as the realization arrived, so did the decision to bury it. I packed it away in a quiet, locked room in the back of my mind. Julian was my friend. My best friend. He was a fixed point in my often turbulent universe. He was also, as far as I knew, completely and unshakably straight. He talked about his ex-girlfriends, about dates he went on with women from his office, about the kind of future he envisioned for himself, and it was a future that had no room for the kind of love I felt for him. To confess would be an act of profound selfishness. It would be like setting a bomb in the foundation of the home we had built together, all for the slim, unlikely chance that he might feel the same way. It was a risk I couldn't take. The potential loss was too great. So I became an expert in concealment. I learned to moderate my gaze, to temper the warmth in my voice, to treat the constant, low-level ache in my chest as a kind of background noise, the hum of a refrigerator you only notice when it stops. I became a better photographer, pouring all of that unspoken emotion, all of that yearning, into my work. My photos became quieter, more intimate, more focused on the spaces between things, on the tension in a gesture, the story in a shadow. I was documenting my own secret life, one frame at a time. The shift, when it came, was not a gentle transition. It was a fracture. It began the night his relationship with Amelia ended. I had only met her a handful of times. She was perfectly nice, smart, and beautiful in a way that seemed both effortless and intimidating. She and Julian had been together for almost 2 years, and I had learned to compartmentalize the specific, sharp pang of jealousy I felt whenever I saw them together. It was just another thing to be packed away in that locked room. He called me around midnight. His voice was raw, thin. "Can I come over?" he asked, and there was no energy in it, none of his usual bounce. Just a flat, hollowed-out sound. He didn't need to say anything else. I told him, of course, and 20 minutes later he was at my door, looking like a ship that had been torn from its anchor and battered by a storm. He didn't cry, not at first. He just sank onto my sofa, his body folding in on itself, and stared at the blank television screen. I made him tea, which he held in his hands for warmth but didn't drink. I sat with him in the quiet, offering the only thing I could, my presence. The silence stretched, filled only by the ticking of the clock on my wall. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "She said I'm not really there," he said, not looking at me. "She said it feels like I'm always searching for something, like I'm keeping a part of myself locked away." Even from me, he let out a dry, humorless laugh. "She's not wrong. I just don't know what it is I'm supposed to be looking for." I didn't know what to say. Every comforting platitude felt like a lie. Instead, I just sat there, a silent sentinel, as he finally let the grief wash over him. He cried then, not loudly, but with a kind of deep, shuddering quiet that was far more devastating. It was the sound of a foundation cracking. And instinctively, without thinking, I reached out and put my hand on his back, rubbing slow, steady circles between his shoulder blades. That night was the first time he stayed over. He fell asleep on the sofa, exhausted by emotion, and I covered him with a blanket, watching the troubled lines on his forehead slowly smooth out in sleep. I felt a fierce, protective ache in my chest. It was a dangerous feeling, a mixture of love and pity and a profound sense of responsibility. He was adrift, and he had chosen my shore to wash up on. From that night on, something between us was irrevocably altered. The easy equilibrium of our friendship was gone, replaced by a new dynamic. He needed me in a way he never had before. He became quieter, more withdrawn from the rest of the world, but he clung to me. Our time together intensified. He was at my apartment more than his own. He was seeking refuge, and I was all too willing to provide it. I told myself it was what any good friend would do. But deep down, in that locked room where the truth lived, I knew it was more than that. I was letting him in, and in doing so, I was letting my own hope, that dangerous, fragile thing, begin to seep out. The ritual began on a Friday night, about a month after the breakup. We were on my couch, watching an old black-and-white movie, the kind we both loved. The apartment was dark except for the flickering monochrome light from the screen. Julian had been quiet all evening, his usual running commentary absent. He seemed to be shrinking, drawing into himself. Halfway through the film, he shifted, and then, without a word, he rested his head on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. It was such a simple gesture, so devoid of artifice, yet it felt like a seismic event. I could feel the warmth of his cheek through the thin fabric of my shirt. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I was hyper-aware of every point of contact, the weight of his head, the way his arm was pressed against mine, the soft sound of his breathing as it began to deepen and even out. I sat there, perfectly still, for what felt like hours, my own muscles cramping, terrified that if I moved, I would break the spell. He fell asleep, and I let him. I watched the rest of the movie through a blur, my mind not processing the plot, but instead cataloging every sensation, every nuance of this new, terrifying proximity. When the credits rolled and the apartment was plunged back into darkness, I didn't move. I just sat there, in the quiet, with Julian sleeping on my shoulder, feeling a profound sense of peace and a wild, screaming panic all at once. This was the precipice. This was the place from which there was no easy return. Eventually, the discomfort in my neck became too much to ignore. I gently shook his shoulder. "Julian," I whispered. He mumbled something incoherent, shifting slightly. "Hey." The movie's over. He lifted his head slowly, blinking in the dim light, looking disoriented. "Oh," he said, his voice thick with sleep. "Sorry. I guess I was more tired than I thought." There was no awkwardness in his voice, no hint that he considered the act anything other than the simple seeking of comfort between friends. It was I who was imbuing it with meaning. It was I who was turning an innocent gesture into a loaded confession. But it happened again, and again. It became our new normal. Movie nights on the couch were no longer about the movie. They were about the slow, inevitable slide toward contact. Sometimes he would initiate it, a slow lean that felt both hesitant and determined. Other times, I would find myself subtly shifting, creating an invitation, a space for him to fill. We never spoke of it. It was a silent agreement, a ritual enacted in the dark where its implications could be safely ignored. It was a beautiful, agonizing hypocrisy. In the daylight, we were friends, our interactions marked by an easy, platonic camaraderie. But in the quiet of the evenings, in the flickering light of a screen, we were something else entirely. We were two people clinging to each other for warmth, for comfort, for something neither of us dared to name. I lived for those moments, and I was terrified of them. Each time his head rested on my shoulder, a part of me soared, and another part braced for the inevitable crash. The ritual escalated, as rituals often do. It migrated from the couch to my bed. It started with a thunderstorm, another cinematic cliché. The power in his building had gone out, and he'd shown up at my door, laughing about being a refugee from the dark ages. We stayed up late talking, and when it was time for him to go, the storm was still raging. "Mind if I just crash on the couch?" he asked. I don't fancy trying to navigate my dark apartment building in this. My own heart was a storm. "Don't be ridiculous," I heard myself say, the words feeling like they belonged to someone braver than I was. "You can take the bed." "I'll take the couch," he protested, of course, but I insisted. I lay on the sofa for hours, listening to the rain lash against the windows and the sound of him moving around in my bedroom, in my space. It felt impossibly intimate. I could hear the soft creak of the mattress as he settled in, and I imagined him there, in my bed, surrounded by my things, my scent. Sleep was impossible. Around 3 in the morning, my bedroom door opened. I saw his silhouette in the faint light from the street. "Leo," he whispered. "You awake?" My heart stopped. "Yeah," I managed to say, my voice raspy. He hesitated in the doorway. "I can't sleep," he said. "The thunder. It's a lot." It was a flimsy excuse. Julian had never been afraid of storms. We both knew it was a pretext, but it was the one we needed. Would it be weird if I? He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The unspoken request hung in the air between us. "Come in. Stay with me." I swallowed, my throat dry. "No," I said, the word a quiet surrender. It wouldn't be weird. He slipped back into the room, and a moment later, I heard him get back into the bed. I lay on the couch, my mind racing. What had I just agreed to? What was happening? After another 10 minutes of torturous silence, I got up and walked to my bedroom. He had moved to one side of the queen-sized bed, leaving a wide, empty space. I slid under the covers, my body rigid, trying to maintain as much distance as possible. The bed felt like a vast, empty continent with the two of us on opposite shores. And then he moved. He rolled over, his back to me, and in his sleep, or what I assumed was sleep, his arm reached out, his hand finding my waist. He pulled me closer, fitting my body against his back, his legs tangling with mine. It was a gesture of pure, unconscious instinct. He murmured something, a soft, sleepy sound, and settled into a deeper rhythm of breathing. I lay there, spooned against his back, my face buried in his shoulder, and I finally understood the meaning of exquisite agony. I was closer to him than I had ever been, holding him, being held by him, and it was all under the guise of sleep, of plausible deniability. I felt like a thief, stealing a moment of intimacy that wasn't meant for me. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I just lay there, breathing him in, memorizing the feeling of his body against mine, and praying for a morning that would never come. This became the new, more intense phase of the ritual. When he stayed over, which was often, we shared the bed. We never discussed it. It just became the default. We would fall asleep on opposite sides, and sometime in the night, we would find our way to each other, our bodies seeking contact in the dark. It was a silent, nocturnal confession, but it was in his apartment that the ritual took on its most potent, symbolic form. When I would stay there, sleeping on his couch, he started leaving his bedroom door ajar. That 6-inch gap, that sliver of light, it was a standing invitation. An unanswered question he asked me night after night. And night after night, I would stand in the hallway, just as I was tonight, my heart a battlefield of hope and fear. To walk through that door would be to change the question. It would no longer be his to ask, but mine to answer. It would mean stepping out of the shadows of ambiguity and into the light, whatever that light might reveal. My photography became my only outlet. I started a new series, untitled, a collection of images of empty spaces that felt full of presence. A rumpled indentation on a pillow, a coffee cup left on a nightstand, a door left slightly ajar, a slice of warm light falling on a dark floor. I was trying to capture the feeling of being haunted by a presence, of a room that holds the echo of a person. I was documenting the architecture of our unspoken relationship. Each photo was a testament to my patience and to my cowardice. I was so adept at seeing, at framing, at understanding the story from the outside. But I was terrified to step into the frame myself. I was terrified of becoming the subject. Because subjects are vulnerable. They are seen. And I had spent so long hiding, I wasn't sure I knew how to be seen anymore, especially by him. Tonight, standing in this hallway, something felt different. The air was thick with a finality I couldn't explain. Perhaps it was the exhaustion in my own heart. I was tired of the guessing games, tired of analyzing every gesture, every breath, for a meaning that might not be there. I was tired of living in the hallway. The silence from his room was no longer just quiet. It was expectant. It was waiting. I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears, a steady, rhythmic drumming. "You can't stand here forever," a voice in my head whispered. "You either walk away, or you walk in. There is no more middle ground." The hallway had ceased to be a waiting room. It had become a choice. I took a deep breath, the air cool and still against my face. My hand left the doorframe. My feet, of their own volition, began to move. I stepped over the line of light on the floor, crossing the threshold from the darkness of the hall into the warm, dim space of his room. I had done it. I had walked in. The room was bathed in the soft glow of a single lamp on his nightstand. It smelled like him, a familiar, comforting scent of clean laundry and something uniquely Julian. He was lying on his side, facing the door, his eyes open. He was watching me. There was no surprise in his expression, only a quiet, unnerving stillness. The plausible deniability was gone. We were both awake. We were both aware. The pretense had been stripped away, and all that was left was the raw, terrifying truth of the moment. I stopped at the foot of his bed, my hands clenched at my sides. The silence was a physical presence in the room, a heavy blanket pressing down on us. He didn't speak. He just looked at me, his gaze steady, searching. I felt completely exposed, as if the lens had been turned back on me, my own carefully constructed defenses dissolving under his stare. This was it, the moment of truth, the crash I had been bracing for. He would ask me what I was doing. He would look confused, maybe even angry, and the beautiful, fragile thing we had built would shatter into a million pieces. I braced myself for the impact. But the question he asked was not the one I expected. He pushed himself up slightly, propping himself on one elbow. His voice, when it came, was soft, almost fragile. "Leo," he said, and my name was a question in itself. I could only manage a nod. He held my gaze for a long moment, and I could see a universe of conflict in his eyes. Fear, confusion, and something else. Something that looked terrifyingly like hope. "Would it be okay?" he began, his voice dropping to a near whisper, so quiet I had to strain to hear it over the frantic beating of my own heart. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The world stopped. The air left my lungs in a silent rush. The question, the one I had never dared to even form in the privacy of my own mind, was just there, hanging in the space between us. It was so simple, so direct, so utterly vulnerable. It wasn't a demand or an assumption. It was a request for permission. It was an offering of trust. It laid his own uncertainty bare, offering it to me as a gift. All the months of ambiguity, of silent rituals and unspoken feelings, crystallized into this one, perfect, terrifying question. He was giving me the choice. He was giving me all the power. And in that moment, the fear that had been my constant companion for so long finally, blessedly, receded. It was replaced by a wave of clarity so profound it was like seeing color for the very first time. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. I walked the few steps to the side of his bed and sat down on the edge of the mattress. It dipped under my weight, and the movement brought us closer. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I let him see everything I had kept hidden for so long. All the yearning, all the love, all the fear. I let him see it all in my eyes. And then I leaned in. He met me halfway. The first touch of his lips against mine was not passionate or demanding. It was tentative. It was a question being answered, a story finding its first word. It was soft and warm, and it tasted faintly of the mint tea we had shared hours earlier. It was a kiss of profound relief. It was the feeling of a key finally turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. It was the sound of a held breath being released. I rested my hand on his cheek, my thumb stroking the slight roughness of his stubble. He deepened the kiss ever so slightly, a sigh escaping his lips and mingling with my own breath. It was a kiss that felt less like a beginning and more like a homecoming. It was an acknowledgement of a truth that had been living between us all along, a truth we had both been too afraid to name. When we finally pulled apart, it was only by a few inches. Our foreheads rested against each other. His eyes were still closed, his breathing a little unsteady. "Okay," he whispered, as if to himself. Just that one word. It was a word of acceptance, of realization, of surrender. And in the quiet of his room, with the city sleeping outside his window, I finally felt the ground beneath my feet again. The hallway was gone. The threshold had been crossed. We were in a new room now, together, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what the light might reveal. The morning after a truth is spoken is a strange and fragile thing. I woke first, disoriented by the unfamiliar weight of an arm slung across my chest and the warmth of another person's breath on my neck. For a moment, I was suspended in a blissful amnesia, and then the memory of the night before came rushing back, a tidal wave of warmth and terror. I had kissed Julian. He had kissed me. We had fallen asleep in each other's arms, not as a matter of unconscious comfort, but as a deliberate choice. I lay perfectly still, listening to the steady, rhythmic sound of his breathing, and I felt a joy so sharp and pure it was almost painful. But hot on its heels came the fear. What now? What did this mean? We had crossed a line, a beautiful, shimmering line, but on the other side was an unknown country with no map. When Julian finally began to stir, I pretended to be asleep. It was a cowardly act, but I was suddenly terrified of the first look, the first word. I needed a moment to brace myself. I felt him shift, his arm tightening around me for a moment before he seemed to realize where he was and quickly withdrew it. The loss of his warmth was immediate and stark. I heard him sit up, the bed creaking under his movement. I kept my eyes closed, my breathing even. Faking asleep, I was nowhere near. The silence stretched, and it was a different kind of silence from the night before. It was not expectant, it was tense, brittle. I could feel his gaze on me, and I had to fight the urge to open my eyes. Finally, I heard him get out of bed, the soft padding of his feet on the hardwood floor as he walked out of the room. He closed the door behind him. Not all the way. He left it slightly ajar. My heart sank. That sliver of a gap, which had once been a symbol of hope and unspoken invitation, now felt like an escape hatch. A way for him to retreat back into the safety of ambiguity. I lay there for a long time, the joy of the previous night curdling into a familiar, sour anxiety. I had been a fool. I had misinterpreted everything. For him, it had been a moment of confusion, of post-breakup loneliness. For me, it had been the culmination of everything I had ever felt. I had stepped into the frame, and in doing so, I had overexposed the image, bleaching it of all its subtlety, all its truth. I had ruined it. I finally forced myself to get up, the sheets feeling cold and empty. I walked into the living room, and he was there, standing by the window, his back to me, staring down at the waking city. He was fully dressed. He was holding a mug of coffee he had made, but he wasn't drinking it. "Hey," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He flinched, as if startled, though he must have heard me approach. He turned around, and his face was a mask of strained neutrality. He couldn't meet my eyes. "Morning," he said, his voice tight. I have to go. Early meeting." Forgot about it. It was a clumsy, obvious lie. Julian never had meetings on Saturdays. The distance between us, which had been erased so completely just hours before, was now a chasm. He had retreated to his side, and I was stranded on mine. "Julian," I started, but I didn't know how to finish. What could I say? What was last night? What are we? The questions felt too large, too heavy to be spoken aloud. He didn't wait for me to finish. He moved towards the door, grabbing his keys from the bowl on the table. I'll call you later," he said, his hand already on the doorknob. And then he was gone. The sound of the door closing behind him was deafeningly final. I was left alone in his apartment, the scent of his coffee still hanging in the air, a ghost of a domesticity that wasn't real. The next few days were a special kind of hell. It was the silence of the hallway, but stretched to encompass our entire lives. My phone remained quiet. My texts to him, casual, carefully worded inquiries about his day, were answered with short, delayed responses. "Fine, busy, talk soon." Each one was a small, polite dismissal. He was building a wall, brick by painful brick, and I was forced to stand by and watch. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in his bedroom withered and died, leaving behind a bitter, ashen taste. I oscillated between a deep, wounded anger and a crushing sadness. I felt used. I had been a port in his emotional storm, a source of temporary comfort, and now that the storm was passing, he was setting sail again, leaving me behind on the shore. I tried to lose myself in my work, but the magic was gone. My studio, usually my sanctuary, felt like a prison. I looked at the photos I had taken, the series about the empty spaces, the open doors, and they mocked me. They were monuments to my own naivety. I had been so focused on capturing the feeling of presence and absence that I hadn't prepared myself for the reality of true absence. The real, painful void he had left behind. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I just walked through my apartment, a ghost in my own life, haunted by the memory of a single, perfect kiss and the devastating silence that followed. After a week of this agonizing limbo, something inside me broke. It was a quiet snap, a realization that the pain of not knowing was worse than any truth he could possibly tell me. I couldn't live in this hallway anymore. I needed the door to be either fully open or definitively shut. I needed an ending to the story, even if it was one that broke my heart. I put on my jacket, my hands moving with a strange, detached sense of purpose, and I walked to his apartment. I didn't know what I was going to say. I only knew that the silence had to end. I stood outside his door, the same door I had entered with such hope a week earlier, and I knocked. The sound echoed in the quiet hallway. It took him a long time to answer. When he finally opened the door, he looked terrible. He was pale, with dark circles under his eyes, and he was wearing the same sweatshirt he'd had on 3 days ago. He looked as haunted as I felt. When he saw me, his expression was a mixture of panic and something that looked like relief. "Leo," he said, his voice rough. "What are you doing here? Can I come in?" I asked. My voice was steady, much steadier than I felt. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped back, letting me pass. His apartment was a mess. Takeout containers were stacked on the coffee table, clothes were draped over chairs. It was the apartment of someone who was falling apart. He closed the door behind me, and we stood there, in the middle of his living room, 2 feet apart, the space between us charged with a week's worth of unspoken words. "I just need you to tell me the truth, Julian," I said, my voice quiet but firm. I looked him directly in the eye, refusing to let him look away. "I can handle it. Whatever it is. If it was a mistake, if you regret it, if it was just about Amelia, just tell me. I deserve that. But this silence. I can't do this." I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Shame, maybe. He finally broke our gaze, turning away to run a hand through his messy hair. He paced the small space of his living room like a caged animal. "It wasn't a mistake," he said, his back still to me. His voice was so low I could barely hear it. "That's the problem. It was the most real thing I've felt in, maybe ever." He stopped pacing and leaned his hands against the wall, his head hanging down. "And it terrifies me." He finally turned back to face me, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. The mask was gone. All that was left was a raw, aching vulnerability. "All my life, Leo," he began, his voice cracking, "I've had this roadmap. You go to school, you get a good job, you meet a nice girl, you get married. It's the story everyone tells you. It's the story I told myself." He gestured vaguely around the room, at the life he had built. "I did all the things. I followed the map. But I always felt lost, like I was navigating someone else's city. Amelia was right. A part of me was always somewhere else. I just never knew where." He took a shaky breath. "And then, with you, especially after she left, the comfort, the quiet, it felt like coming home. It felt like I'd finally found the place on the map I was always looking for. But it wasn't a place I ever expected to find. It wasn't a place I knew how to navigate." He looked at me, his expression pleading. "That night, when I kissed you, it wasn't about being lonely. It was about seeing. For the first time, I saw where I was. I saw that the place I felt safe, the person I felt most myself with was you. And the moment I saw it, I panicked. Because it meant the map I've been following my whole life is wrong. It means I'm not who I thought I was. And I don't know who I am, Leo. And I'm so scared of pulling you into that mess. I'm scared of hurting you because I'm so damn lost." His confession hung in the air between us, beautiful and painful and honest. All my anger, all my hurt, evaporated, replaced by a wave of overwhelming empathy. He hadn't been running from me. He had been running from himself. The wall he had built wasn't to keep me out. It was to keep his own terrifying realization caged in. I closed the distance between us, and this time, I was the one who initiated the contact. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him into a hug. He was stiff at first, surprised, and then he just sagged against me, his own arms coming up to wrap tightly around my waist. He buried his face in my shoulder, and I felt the warmth of his tears soaking through my shirt. I just held him, my hand stroking his hair, murmuring quiet, comforting words. We stood there for a long time, holding on to each other in the middle of his messy living room. 2 lost people finally finding their way back to the same map. There were no grand declarations of love, no promises of a perfect future. There was just this, the solid, reassuring weight of each other, the quiet understanding that we were both scared, and that maybe, just maybe, we could be scared together. We started again, slowly, tentatively, like 2 people learning a new language. The days that followed were filled with conversations, long talks that stretched late into the night. We talked about everything we had left unsaid for years. He told me about the persistent, low-level loneliness that had followed him through his relationships, the feeling of never being fully known. I told him about the day I fell in love with him while building a bookshelf, about the quiet ache of hiding that love, about the fear of losing our friendship. We laid all our cards on the table, all our fears, all our hopes. We were dismantling the old structure of our friendship, board by board, and carefully, deliberately, building something new in its place. The intimacy that grew between us was different from the fraught, ambiguous closeness we had shared before. It was intentional. It was honest. The first time he took my hand as we walked down the street, his fingers lacing through mine, it felt both shockingly new and completely natural. I felt a blush creep up my neck, a self-consciousness that was quickly replaced by a profound sense of rightness. We were no longer hiding in the dark, in the quiet of our apartments. We were stepping into the light, together. The cuddling on the couch returned, but it was different now. There was no pretense of sleep, no plausible deniability. It was a simple, open expression of affection. He would pull me close, and I would lean into his warmth without a trace of the old anxiety, my heart steady and calm. The peace I felt in those moments was something I had never known before. It was the peace of being exactly where you were supposed to be. The door to his bedroom was no longer left ajar. It was either wide open, an explicit invitation for me to join him, or it was closed with both of us on the same side of it. The symbol of our uncertainty had been transformed into a symbol of our choice. We were choosing this. We were choosing each other, every day, in small ways and large ones. We learned the rhythms of each other's bodies, the landscape of each other's minds. We learned that his frantic energy was often a shield for his anxiety, and that my quietness was not a sign of detachment, but of deep observation. We learned to read the stories in each other's silences. One rainy Sunday morning, months later, I woke up in his bed. The light filtering through the blinds was gray and soft. Julian was still asleep, his face relaxed and peaceful, one arm thrown over my chest. I lay there, watching him, and I thought about the journey that had brought us to this quiet, simple moment. The chance meeting in the rain, the slow, careful building of a friendship, the painful, beautiful fracturing of that friendship, and the delicate, honest reconstruction of something stronger, something truer. It had not been an easy path. It had been filled with fear and misunderstanding and heartache. But it had led us here. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. As the machine gurgled and hissed, I looked around his apartment. It was no longer just his space. My camera was on the bookshelf, my favorite mug was next to the sink, my jacket was hanging by the door. We were slowly, imperceptibly, merging our lives, creating a shared geography. When the coffee was ready, I poured 2 cups and brought them back to the bedroom. He was awake now, sitting up against the pillows, a sleepy smile on his face. "Morning," he said, his voice husky. I handed him a mug and sat on the edge of the bed. He took a sip, his eyes never leaving my face. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. I smiled. "I was just thinking about that first night," I said. In the taxi, he grinned, that same wide, uninhibited grin I had fallen in love with. "The great taxi heist of Astor Place," he said. "The beginning of it all, yeah," I said, my voice soft. "The beginning." We sat there, sipping our coffee in the quiet of the rainy morning, and the silence between us was no longer heavy or expectant. It was comfortable. It was full. It was the sound of home. We never did define the exact moment things changed. Was it the first time he fell asleep on my shoulder? The night we first shared a bed? The kiss? The painful conversation that followed? I realized it wasn't a single moment. It was a process, a slow and gradual erosion of the boundaries we had built around ourselves, a turning of tides. Our story wasn't a single photograph, a decisive moment captured in a flash. It was more like a long exposure, a slow gathering of light in the dark, creating an image that was rich and deep and a little blurry around the edges, but utterly, breathtakingly real. We had learned to stop standing in the hallway, analyzing the light, and to simply walk into the room, trusting that we could build a life there, together. We had learned to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned how to create.